Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Kalamata, Greece on September 2nd in 2025. During nearly 2 years of unrelenting genocide in Gaza, citizens of conscience from around the world have mounted countless peaceful protests. Israel's genocidal war on Palestinians has probably generated more peaceful protests during the past 2 years than any other single issue on the planet. And yet, few governments, especially in the West, have taken robust action to stop Israel's genocide. Frustrated by government indifference to and even support for Israel's heinous crimes against the Palestinian people, some very determined activists have gone beyond peaceful protest. One method certain of these activists have employed is to do damage to the manufacturing facilities of corporations that are profiting from the mass slaughter of Palestinians. And perhaps no group that has gone down this path has garnered as much attention, at least in the West, as Palestine Action. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Calla Walsh, a Palestine Action activist. Calla is a 21-year-old anti-imperialist organizer, writer, and freelance journalist based in the so-called United States. That's how Calla refers to it, I understand. She founded Palestine Action U.S., served time in jail last year for attacking an Elbit Systems weapons manufacturer in New Hampshire, and helped permanently close the Elbit facility in the U.S. in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Elbit, of course, is the murderous Israeli drone manufacturer that has the blood of countless innocents on its hands, not only in Palestine, but in other countries of West Asia as well. A hearty welcome to you from Reason to Resist, Calla. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to get into this discussion.
Wonderful. So let's begin, Calla, with the action that resulted from your imprisonment. Could you tell us what happened at the Elbit Systems factory on that day?
Yeah. Well, I think in your introduction, you really got to the core of like the thrust behind Palestine Action, which is that we see the inadequacy of peaceful protests 2 years into this genocide, but also beforehand. I mean, Palestine Action started in the UK in 2020, and before the Al-Aqsa flood had already succeeded in permanently closing Elbit factories. They saw that just begging the leaders in power who are paid for by weapons manufacturers whose material interests are embedded in imperialism, that begging them to change policy is not working, and that we have to take international law into our own hands to try and stop the shipment of weapons. So the action I did time in jail for, that was in New Hampshire at an Elbit factory that is producing helicopter parts, screens for weapons and vehicles and weapon systems. And we had kind of a tri-pronged attack to shut down business at the facility for the day. Some folks blockaded the driveway. Some folks besieged the front of the building, and 3 of us occupied the rooftop until we were arrested, and we tried to cause material damages using hammers, using spray paint. And that led to that facility having over $100,000 in damages, several employees quitting, and lots of, in the words of Elbit in the state, lots of emotional trauma and fear instilled in the employees. And so lots of changes in how they operate business as usual. But unfortunately, it did not lead to the closure of that facility or as many impacts as we would have liked to see. And in the US, you know, the laws around property are a lot stricter. We may have more freedom of speech. Like, I can still say I support Palestine Action. We are all Palestine Action. Whereas if I went on the street in London and did that right now, I would get arrested because of the illegitimate terrorist prescription of Palestine Action. But here we kind of immediately experienced a harsher crackdown on property damage and faced heavier charges, whereas Pal Action UK, it took, you know, years and years before the state really like heavily cracked down and started locking up all these people indefinitely under counterterrorism legislation. And that is because of how dangerous and effective their tactics were and how much of a threat that they posed to the continuation of business as usual. And so while I talk about my own action, I really want to center the folks in the UK who have carried on this campaign for much longer and are really bearing heavy sacrifices. I mean, we're talking in the context of one of those prisoners being on her 23rd day of hunger strike and imminently facing death. So I know I'm jumping ahead of myself, but
we're definitely going to get.
Yeah. But as the movement has gone on, in the West, like there is kind of a stagnant focus on certain tactics, on peaceful protests. And then I think there's people who really want to challenge us to escalate and to up the stakes and to build our own resistance.
So as I mentioned at the outset, you were imprisoned for this action. Could you tell us about the legal process? Specifically, what did they charge you with? Who else was charged? And did you enter a plea deal or did you go to trial?
Yeah, so 3 of us were initially arrested, and then a 4th person was arrested a couple months later after the investigation identified her, and we became known as the Merrimack Four. We were charged with a series of felonies that included riot, burglary, criminal mischief, criminal trespass, conspiracy to falsify physical evidence, and sabotage. The sabotage charge was like a wartime law. It was written during the Vietnam War. No one had ever been charged with that in the state of New Hampshire before. And it was specific to inhibiting the U.S. or its allies' defense capabilities in a time of war. They actually had to drop that charge, which had a mandatory 1-year minimum sentence because there was no state of emergency declared and apparently was only applicable during a state of emergency. But we were facing all those other felonies. The charges amounted to what could be 37 years in prison. And so we really had to grapple with the reality that we might be in prison for the rest of our lives. I was also facing 3 felonies and a misdemeanor charge in Massachusetts related to actions targeting the facility here in the city of Cambridge, where I grew up and where we actually permanently shut down that facility. And also at the outset of the New Hampshire case, the FBI declared that they were also investigating us. They seized my phone. We're all under heavy surveillance and investigation, and we were given no contact orders. So my co-defendants and I could not even speak to each other for most of the duration of our case, which is a common repressive tactic used against political defendants to fracture our social networks, to tear apart our ability to be in solidarity with each other and really build a political collective defense. But what I'd emphasize is that these heavy charges are meant to, scare people and intimidate people, but usually they do not stick in the end. They're meant to apply pressure to get people to snitch on their comrades. And so it's really important to stay steadfast because we did eventually reach a plea agreement. We pled out to 2 misdemeanors and we only served 40 days in jail. And now we're on suspended sentences where if we get arrested for anything in the next 3 years, we'd automatically go to prison for 2 years. So that's kind of hanging over my head and forcing me to have to move differently. But ultimately, we felt really, really relieved and lucky at the short amount of time we spent in jail compared to what the charges we were facing are and compared to, how long our fellow political prisoners in the U.S. have been locked up for, and especially people in the UK who are being held indefinitely on counterterrorism charges.
Mm-hmm. So what were conditions like in prison for you?
Prison or jail, we were in a jail, and jails tend to be worse than prisons in the U.S. because it's, more temporary. There's a lot of turnover. I would say, the prison and jail system, the carceral system in the U.S. is a form of genocide. It's modern slavery, and it's horrific and brutal to see primarily the treatment of very, very poor women in there. But when I talk about jail, I don't want to emphasize the most brutal parts because I think we need to think of jails and prisons as a site of struggle. And when I think back on my time in there, I think about the friends that we made and the women who we helped politicize and who were so curious about why we were in there. And we got to speak about our action. We got to teach them about Palestine. And to them, it was so immediately comprehensible as to why, we would take direct action against a weapons factory that is manufacturing and profiteering from genocide. And so we had a really robust support system, getting us letters, getting us books, and we got a lot of, attention and support throughout the entire time we were in there, especially compared to regular inmates who might have no one fighting for them on the outside or no one adding money to their books so they can make calls or buy food from commissary. And again, this was only over the course of 40 days. And it got to a point where we were getting a lot of letters and we were about to get released. And we asked our supporters to please write to longer term political prisoners who are often forgotten about or ignored in the movement. And so all that goes to say is I think it's important not to talk about prisoners or treat prisoners like they are dead, because there is life inside and it is a site of struggle and resistance. And there's no better example of that than Palestine. I mean, the Al-Aqsa flood itself was a prison break, and it was also waged to win the release of Palestinian political prisoners, which it did, and which I believe it will continue to do as the resistance continues to struggle.
I'm very much in agreement with your, although I have not, at least up until now, had to serve prison time for my work for the Palestinian cause, and I hope that remains to be true. I'm very moved and in agreement with your comment that in these circumstances, prison is a place of struggle. And it brought to mind immediately when you said that, the case of Georges Abdallah, the Lebanese revolutionary who was just released from a jail in France after spending 41 years for taking action to defend the Palestinian people. After seeing him come out of prison, and he spoke as, like you, with such eloquence and calm and ongoing commitment to the cause, it seems to me that the only way you can survive an experience like that is to know that you're on the right side of history, to know that your cause is just, and that will carry you through. If you have the mental fortitude. And I'm really, I'm grateful that you described it there as a place of struggle. Now, when you were in court, the New Hampshire Journal described you as being unrepentant. Do you think that is a fair description? And if so, are you still unrepentant?
Absolutely. I mean, that was referring to my sentencing when we had a chance to say some final words, and I said, "Free Palestine." I wish I said more, honestly. I'm certainly unrepentant. I do not regret the action that we did. If I could go back, I would do it again, and I would do it better. My regret is that we didn't, raise that facility to the ground, because it still is standing there producing weapons today, unfortunately. And I really appreciate you bringing up Georges Abdallah, since I think he is he epitomizes, what it means to have political prisoners be the compass of our struggle. And when he was released, he said, "You released me, you, the movement, struggling to free me, the resistance, you freed me." It wasn't like the changing conscience of the French government. It was the relentless resistance. It was people always believing he would be free and never giving up hope. Whereas in some of the discourse I see about political prisoners in the West, it kind of treats like their lifelong incarceration as inevitable and not something that can be struggled against. There was an amazing quote he said in an interview after his release that I've kept coming back to, where he said, and I have this written down because I keep coming back to it, so I want to just read it, where he said, "The one who resists is the one who has the final say and determines what should and should not be done. The ultimate decision maker is the one who sacrifices himself to the resistance. All spectators have no right to discuss any topic." And I think that really speaks to the centering of the resistance of the Palestinian prisoners in our movement and what we should aspire to in our struggle in the West, as the crackdown is only intensifying. There's only going to be more prisoners in the West, and we are going to need to fight for their freedom by any means necessary.
Now, poll after poll shows, not only in the United States, but definitely in the United States, plummeting support for the genocidal Israeli entity. In your work as a Palestine Action activist, have you seen this reflected in sort of the public support, people coming forward and wanting to become involved in the work of Palestine Action? Or is it pretty much remained the same group of people over time?
Yeah, it's complicated because, in terms of Palestine Action, Pal Action U.S. really ceased to exist, honestly, after our arrests in New Hampshire. We were hit with really heavy repression, not just those state charges, but the federal investigation. And that made us realize that we really needed to kind of shift tactically in how we were organizing with the level of repression we were facing. And I think that's something folks in the UK are also grappling with now that there is a illegitimate terrorist prescription. You can't just keep moving exactly how you were before. We need to adapt our own tactics in accordance with the escalating repression, and we need to, have better security. We need to build out our infrastructure to withstand repression, lean into more, clandestine organizing, all of that sort. And so I think since that era where Pal Action U.S. was incredibly active in basically the 6 weeks immediately following the Al-Aqsa flood, because we immediately understood our responsibility to resist here, we've seen direct actions continue and actually pick up a lot more, particularly around the student intifada. But they've been of very different characters, claimed by different groups, targeting various different targets. I mean, several of the political prisoners that are locked up right now in the U.S. in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, they were targeting police infrastructure. They're accused of burning police vehicles, not necessarily targeting weapons companies. But I think people are understanding their role not just as, a Palestine solidarity movement, but understanding that the best thing we can do to help Palestine is to start a revolution here, wherever we find ourselves, but particularly in the US. I think with the mainstreaming of kind of a pro-Palestine position, we see all these polls where Gen Z in a majority not only, is against the Zionist entity, but also directly supports the Palestinian armed resistance, which is unimaginable a few years ago before the Al-Aqsa flood. But we need to not only focus on, the Zionist entity, but also the broader world system of US-led imperialism, which is our ultimate enemy. And certainly the axis of resistance and the Palestinian resistance understands that. But we need to, apply that to our own analysis and how we are organizing here in the imperial core, and understand how our liberation is dialectically linked to the national liberation struggles in the global South, and that we have a particular role to play here. In attacking the beast from within. And, I think there's a lot of the organizing right now that I see in the US is also focused around prisoner support and against repression, because that is the reality, is that there is a lot more repression coming down. And we know that we can't just continue to escalate if we don't have structures in place to support those who are making the real sacrifices, such as Hoxha and Casey Goonan, the hunger strikers.
Mm-hmm. You said the magic word, revolution. It's a word we really like here, Reason to Resist. Now, let me ask you a more somber question. Now, you didn't plead to a felony. You pled to misdemeanors, but I take it you nonetheless have a criminal record now.
That's right.
Fair? And so how is that affecting your life? For example, your ability to earn a decent living?
Yeah, I'm pretty unemployable. I basically, it tore my life apart, the getting charged, getting caught up with this case. I was already very doxxed before that, so that wasn't necessarily something new. I've definitely struggled to get a job since I was released. I'm living with my family right now, trying to figure out how to go back to school, all this stuff. Whenever I fly, I get treated like Osama bin Laden. The airline can't even print out my boarding pass without getting special permission from the government. And whenever I enter the country, if I leave the country, my phone will get seized, I will get detained, all of that. But it's all an intimidation tactic. And I really, this is what I signed up for. I never expected to challenge power without getting repressed in response. And all those sacrifices are worth it to me. And I wouldn't want it any other way. When I was in jail, this is something I also say about that experience. In many ways, I felt more sane than I do on the outside. And I think the people who have taken acts of resistance, who have gotten themselves locked up because of the extent they were willing to go to resist this genocide, I think they are the most sane people around us. Like, it is not sick, or it is insane to be well-adjusted or like living life as usual as this genocide is going on, as we're seeing the most horrific things we've ever seen live streamed before our eyes every day. And I think those people really, really need to be upheld. And especially with this hunger strike going on right now, I'm thinking about Hoxha and Casey constantly, about how much pain and suffering they're in, but how steadfast and resilient they are, even in such dire conditions of captivity. Their body is their only weapon left, and they are still resisting. And this is something I wrote in the piece that I published about the strike. And I think in a lot of ways, they are freer than those of us on the outside. They are freer because they are resisting still, even in those conditions of captivity.
Sometimes I feel like we're living through a Hollywood masterpiece, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Do you ever watch that movie?
No.
No, well, basically what happens in that movie is the small group of people from disparate parts of the United States who have no connection to each other become obsessed with going to a mountain. And their family members and friends all think they're going nuts. They're completely insane. And finally, several of them make their way. They find this mountain. They make their way there, and to discover that a massive spacecraft bearing intelligent life from another planet has decided to descend upon that mountain and offer these people an opportunity to go see another world. And so, I think sometimes, the people who are doing what you're doing, just as you said, right? They are living in reality. They're living and they're coping with the reality of what is actually happening. But the people out there who are going about their daily lives, knowing in the back of their minds, or maybe even in the forefront of their conscience, that there is the most audacious genocide in human history taking place, and every damn Western government is helping to perpetrate it. Those people are detached from reality, it seems to me. So I feel your words really resonate with me. I'm sure they'll resonate with a lot of people who watch our program. So I want to ask you now about what's going on in the United Kingdom. You've already referred to that. But before we get into the particulars of it, as you mentioned, the Starmer regime has designated Palestine Action in the United Kingdom as a terrorist entity. I'm just interested in your thoughts about this whole notion of terrorism and how Western governments define it and employ it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's really notable this is happening under a Labour government, not a conservative government. It's the same in the U.S. and in Canada. The Liberals and the Conservatives are all, equally complicit in facilitating these illegitimate terrorist designations, which have always been a tool against liberation struggles and anti-imperialist resistance. The origin of terrorist designations in the U.S. was always specifically targeted at the Palestinian liberation movement, and to really sever the ties between the armed resistance in Palestine and in the Arab Iranian region and people organizing in support of them in the West. And we saw that happen at the same time as the Oslo Accords, as really the NGOization of all the social infrastructure, both in Palestine and in the West in these movements, which is all part of, a counterinsurgency to neutralize, to defang the, potential power of these resistance movements. And now increasingly we're seeing terrorist designations not only be targeted at organizations resisting abroad, but also organizations domestically in these countries. We saw it with Samidun in Canada and in the US, where Canada designated it as a terrorist organization and the US designated it as a specially designated entity / sham charity of some sort. And really the effect of those designations is to have a chilling effect. It's to, get people to self-censor and self-police and back down from talking about the resistance or naming the resistance organizations by name. it is really meant to have to cause a behavioral shift. So a lot of the work of these designations is not even being done by the state itself. It's to shift the behavior of people in the movement by instilling fear, and in order to isolate the most militant people in the movement. With Pal Action UK, I think they were facing these threats of the terrorism designation for a long, long time. And despite those threats, they have continued their activity. Despite so many arrests, they have continued resistance. And it got to a point where the UK government could simply not tolerate it anymore, because it set such a dangerous example of steadfastness in resistance. And the Filton 24 are, a key example of this, because they are not even being charged with terrorism charges. They're facing charges like criminal damages and trespass and such, but they're being detained indefinitely under the Counterterrorism Act, just because they're alleged to be affiliated with Palestine Action, which is now a proscribed terrorist group. And the discrimination against them, the unfair treatment and abuses of them in the prison has really, really escalated since this terrorist designation, since the prescription. And we see the same in how prisoners in the U.S. are being treated. Casey Goonan, the U.S. political prisoner on hunger strike with Hoxha, they're about to be sentenced in a couple weeks, but their charges all have terrorism enhancement, which gives the federal government basically direct control and influence over how they're treated in prison, and making it really easy for them to isolate and target and abuse them, and keep them inside for longer, and make it as hard as possible for them to get out. So to me, when the word terrorist is used, by the West, it's synonymous with accusing us of resistance. It's accusing us of fighting for liberation. And so really that should always be taken with a badge of honor.
The Fulton 24, are these the activists who were involved in the action against the Elbit Systems factory in Bristol in the United Kingdom?
Exactly right. It was last August, I believe, and they caused £1 million in damages. They allegedly drove a prison van into the facility, broke in, caused a lot of damage inside the facility where they're manufacturing drones and such. And at first, a few people were arrested, but the number has steadily grown. Even in the past month, more people have been arrested. It was 6, and then it was 18, and now it's the Filton 24. And people are just...
Before I ask you, sorry to interrupt, before I ask you about the Fulton 24, I just want to show people some footage which you directed me to of the action. So let's have a look at that, and then we'll come back to the people who are in prison. Come on. So I understand that you are involved in an action of solidarity and support of the people in the United Kingdom who took part in that heroic act and who are in prison. Could you tell us about this solidarity action? What is it all about? Why is it happening?
Yeah, so as I said, the abuses of the Filton 24 who are being held, who were raided in the middle of the night in many cases, dozens of armed police bursting into the homes of their family, detained in solitary confinement, isolated from anyone else. The unfair treatment has escalated since the prescription. Hoxha, the specific member of the Filton 24 who is on hunger strike right now, on the day that MPs voted to prescribe Pal Action, she was moved from HMP Bronzefield to HMP Peterborough, making it much further away, harder for her loved ones to visit her. And then she has been repeatedly targeted and isolated by the prison administration. They took away her access to recreational activities. They took away her job in the library. And they are threatening other prisoners in this facility that they will be targeted and punished if they even speak to the PAL Action prisoners. And of course, this is rooted in a fear of the prison administration that these politically conscious, resistant prisoners are going to politicize the other captives and organize them. This is a very, familiar tactic with political prisoners over time. And so in response to these abuses, T. Hoxha started a hunger strike. She's now on her 23rd day of hunger strike, and it has been really effective in building pressure. She has won every single one of her demands except for written reinstatement of her position in the library. That's the only one thing left that she's asking for. Like, this is not a hunger strike for her to be freed or for the Filton 24 to be released. It is a hunger strike for a very tangible demand that the prison administration can meet. And that's why we're asking people to call them, to email them relentlessly, to get organizations to blast this call, to get media outlets to cover the strike, since unfortunately there's been a total blackout. And every day that this goes on longer, Hoxha is closer to the brink of death. A few days into a hunger strike, a few days into not eating, your body begins to break down its own fat and muscle stores. It literally begins to cannibalize itself and eat itself alive. After 10 days without eating, you are supposed to be hospitalized, and it's been 23 days and she has not been hospitalized. It took 18 days for them to even give her electrolyte powder. The most recent reports from her loved ones are saying that, she can barely stand up, that she is barely keeping down water, she's losing hair, she's like vomiting when she takes vitamins. And the most powerful action of solidarity with Hoxha has been from a fellow political prisoner, a fellow captive, Casey Goonan, who's locked up in California and is facing sentencing on federal charges in September. Casey is the only prisoner of the student intifada in the U.S. who's still locked up, and they are facing 5 to 20 years, I believe. And they are diabetic, so also doing a hunger strike is very risky for them. They are not taking, insulin anymore, because taking insulin if you're not eating is very dangerous. But Casey released a super powerful statement saying that, we as prisoners in the West locked up for participating in the Palestinian liberation struggle, we have to carry on the steadfastness of the Palestinian prisoner movement. And we cannot let those of us who are locked up for the sacrifices we've made be abandoned by the movement in the West. And that solidarity is action. It's not words. It's not just putting out a statement. It is actually also putting your body on the line. And this tradition of hunger strikes is very rooted in the national liberation struggles of Palestine, of Ireland, and of various solidarity movements. And, the stakes could not be more dire. But unfortunately, I think, Palestine Action and the political prisoners, I think they and their resilience and their fierce resistance exposes kind of the bankruptcy of a lot of the other tactics we're seeing employed in the solidarity movement, or their inefficacy. And so I think a lot of organizations don't want to raise awareness to this strike, or raise awareness to how much these prisoners are being targeted, because it might expose their own inadequacy of only, organizing in institutionally acceptable forms of resistance. So yeah, I'll stop there, but I know we're going to link the toolkit and other information about the strike so people can take action. There's also protests being organized at British embassies, such as in Belgium, and there's no reason that can't be happening at every British embassy and consulate around the West right now. So, we chant the slogan, "Our prisoners are our compass," a lot, but we need to materialize that in our strategy and go out of our way to actively support and defend our prisoners in this hunger strike.
Right. So just to repeat, Calla has provided to me a Word doc or a Google document. It's a toolkit for T. Hoxha and Casey Goonan, and describes briefly ways in which you can help these two prisoners of conscience. And I'm going to put a link to that document in the description to this video on YouTube and Rumble. And, I can't thank you enough, Calla, not only for appearing on our program, but for the immense sacrifices you've made for the devastated Palestinian people. And I'm going to be blunt. I hope that many people are inspired to follow your example. Thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thanks for having me on.
And we're signing off today from Kalamata, Greece for Reason to Resist on September 2nd, 2025.